Okay, good enough. So we'll see what goes on here. And so we're going to be looking at Vietnam today. And I think that the big issue here is, again, pull this into this idea of the liberal consensus and really how that plays into how that can help you to give you some kind of a hook to really deal with what's going on in the United States after 1945. And it is a good thing to keep in mind, although I think we need to remind ourselves a little bit of this, and that is that basically, okay, it's not going to be my classroom. Okay, this is just too much. Somebody else is doing that. Why is he giving this to me? Okay. Anyway, so I'll start and go ahead, but I wanted to kind of think about, or to remind yourselves what we're really talking about with this liberal consensus is this belief on the part of liberals, and it comes out of the Second World War, right? So this might be a dandy time to maybe get some notes or something like that. Those kinds of things. If I never get this bad boy to start, we'll be able to start from there. But remember this idea that, first of all, there's going to be some kind of a welfare state. And in the 1940s and 50s, this really meant Social Security and maybe some unemployment security. Understanding Social Security is more than just old folks' pensions, it's disability, those kinds of things. Secondly, there's going to be a faith in Keynesian counter-cyclical fiscal policies. And remember, counter-cyclical means the business cycle is going down, you borrow and spend, the government is this kind of spender of last resort, is going to actually go up. And the idea is you're going to really kind of cushion the blow from any kind of downturns. And this really comes out of the Great Depression, but particularly it comes out of the lessons learned in the Second World War, as we remember that from the Brinkley article. And then third is this, and we'll talk about this much more today, is this belief and faith that the United States needed to have an internationalist foreign policy that's premised on containment, containing communism abroad and containing communism at home. And then lastly is this belief in the efficacy of reform. And we talked about this a lot with civil rights, anti-war movement, gay rights, this idea that maybe you could have some kind of government action which is going to allow you to solve some kind of social problem. So efficacy means that it's effective. You can actually get out there and you can actually change some issues that you see coming up. And so you think about how we looked at civil rights, where you have this issue, okay, there's segregation in the South, it's patently unfair, it's awful, right? Well, you make some laws and you enforce it, and you can kind of end that. What happens when you go north, where it's geographical segregation, you can ride the bus all you want, but it doesn't go nowhere. And you really start getting into those kind of structural issues of inequality and fairness that undermine this, and then you begin to get this kind of radicalization of civil rights in the late 1970s, and that's what's really going to kind of turn a lot of the formerly liberal constituency, particularly your blue-collar, white, working class, and they're going to say, you know what, we're going to push towards somebody like, say, George Wallace. Does very well in the Milwaukee area. Okay, so that's kind of that idea that you can get out there and you can actually solve problems. Government should be doing this. And of course, where we're heading with all of this is Ronald Reagan and the idea that government's not the problem. It's not the solution. It's actually the problem. And he says that in his inaugural address. So one area we have to start with today, this will work, is looking at Vietnam, and particularly how Vietnam plays into this end of liberalism. Because one area that is very much this consensus is containment. And one other thing is to keep in mind that, this Vietnam was the liberals' war. It's Kennedy, it's Johnson, And, you know, it's this idea of state building, so we'll talk a bit about that. So first of all, I'm just going to put this up. This is really the only, actually the only script that I have on this, but this is to kind of give you a periodization of the war. And to remind you of, if you want a hook for this, I think the biggest, I remember my dissertation advisor, Tom McCormick, used to always say that, you know, really Vietnam in and of itself never really matters to Americans. What really matters is how it connects to other parts of the world. So initially, Vietnam matters because guess what? The French have been there and we want to get them back because we want to help support the French in Europe. And there's a very vibrant communist party in France, and so you help them regain their empire. So we help reintroduce the French into Vietnam after the war. And it's done primarily not because of, you know, this concern of spreading communism, more about the idea of let's get the French back into their empire. And that occasions a very, very nasty war between the Viet Minh and the French. And as we talked about this in terms of massive retaliation. Remember that? You know, how, you know, the idea was, well, you know, maybe you'd use nuclear weapons at Dien Bien Phu. And Eisenhower nixed the nukes. Said, we're not going to use those. Okay, so as a result, the French lost. And what you had then was a kind of an intermezzo period in which the country's divided. The country was divided supposedly temporarily. To be, you know, reunited with elections that were supposed to come after the Geneva Conference, and the United States blocks that and instead founds an independent Republic of South Vietnam and our man Diem. That's really 1956 and 1963 is when Diem is in there, and we'll look at that in much more detail in just a moment. Then there's this period of escalation. From 1963 to 1968, you know, it's kind of takeover effect. The United States goes in. Diem didn't work out, and we'll talk about what happens to him. And you get this escalation where by 1968, there's 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam. And we dropped more bombs in 1 year on South Vietnam than we did during the entire Second World War. You know, just unbelievable. Okay? And then, to get the United States out, Richard Nixon introduces a Vietnamization phase from 69 to 73. And we'll talk about what brings that about. And I have the Mad Bomber down here. This is where you start. Nixon bombs the North. He does bombs into Cambodia and Laos. The United States invades those neutral countries. And it leads to a peace deal between the United States and the North Vietnamese that is supposed to lead to a decent interval. And this is going to be a period of time between 73 and 75, which is going to end rather quickly in April of 75, literally 40 years ago last month. And probably the most famous photos are those of the American embassy with our friends trying to get onto the helicopters, and guys are kicking them off because they don't want to get on there. They're way down the helicopter too much. And so for those of you who want to know where our wonderful Vietnamese food comes from here in the United States, a lot of that was because in the late 1970s, the communists took a lot of people who had supported the United States, and they put them on boats and they just put them out in the ocean. Boat people. And so the U.S. helped bring those people to places like northern Wisconsin, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, those kinds of things. So we got this wonderful cultural infusion as kind of a blowback to empire. That's kind of your overview, and let's just start then. And let's start with Geneva, because we talked about the French phase when we did massive retaliation. What this leads to is a temporary division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Now, where have we seen that before? A division of a country that had communist and non-communist elements? Korea. Yes. And that was the 38th parallel. Now, what's the difference between Vietnam and Korea geographically? I mean, one's in Northeast Asia, one's in Southeast Asia, I know that. Could you walk around the 38th parallel to get in Korea? To get to the south if you were in the north? You're shaking your head no. Why not?
It's a peninsula.
Okay. So the United States is going to, we want to draw a line, create a non-communist South Vietnam, and somehow stop, stabilize this thing like we did in Korea. The problem is, Korea is a peninsula, and we've got overwhelming naval superiority, so we can stop any attempt to go around that parallel. You can have a demilitarized zone in between there, and you can stop those kinds of things from the North Koreans. Well, you can't do that. So we'll come back to this map later. One of the issues is that if you were in North Vietnam, you could literally just walk through Laos and Cambodia and come out in South Vietnam and be ready to go if you wanted to undermine that regime. So, but the point is, in 1954, 1955, there's this temporary division, and the United States spends a lot of time and money and effort bringing supporters of the French down to the south from the north. And in fact, what they did is they literally dropped like little leaflets that promised 5 acres and a water buffalo, I'm not kidding, to people who are willing to immigrate to the south. Kind of 40 acres and a mule, and you get 5 acres and a water buffalo. And the idea was that you're going to bring these guys down, and then the bad guys, the communists, would go up there, and that would get them away from each other, so they wouldn't kill each other, and then you'd have some kind of national elections. Well, the United States refused to have national elections. The Geneva Accords in 1954 said we're going to have a national election which is going to unify the country. That doesn't happen. So what the United States does then is to take this southern part and turn it into the Republic of South Vietnam. They create a nation. And if you read it, there's kind of your standard college textbook on Vietnam is America's Longest War by George Herring. And he talks about it being a legal fiction. You create this nation where no nation existed. You give it a government, you bring in a leader, DM. Okay, what happened to my marker? You bring in DM, who's a Roman Catholic. You bring all these French-speaking Roman Catholics down from the north, and you put them in there as their government in a predominantly Buddhist area. You draw a line at the 17th parallel, and you say, okay, now we've got this nation, and if it falls, that means we've lost in containment, right? And of course, that idea that Vietnam goes, then eventually Cambodia will go, Thailand will go, and I think I actually have a picture of this. Then eventually Indonesia would go, the Philippines, and then Japan would have no choice but to make some kind of accommodation with the Red Chinese, right? I love saying that, the Red Chinese. That's so 50s. Okay, so you get this idea that there's a domino theory out there, and Eisenhower actually uses that. So you can't allow South Vietnam to fall. And I just want to give you this kind of a regional and global perspective on this. The Americans were very much constructing a kind of a liberal global order, at least a first world order, based around things like Bretton Woods, based upon American kind of the idea of having these gap rounds, which were these general agreements on trade and treaty on trade, where you lower tariffs. You would integrate your outlaw core nations like Japan and West Germany back into this to help give the kind of industrial muscle. But you also had to make sure you integrated in enough of this hinterland, if you will, to allow the Japanese, especially someone like the Japanese, to have markets for export and sources of raw material. Japan is a resource-poor place. Now, we've seen this before, where Japan had tried to develop its own area, right? Its own sphere of influence in East Asia. Do you guys remember what that was called?
Prosperity sphere?
Oh, you are good. Yeah, Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And there's a great vignette, I can't remember which book it was in, but it was talking about American occupation in Japan. And this young American officer goes to his office where he's going to be moving in, and they're going to run Japan. Right? It's 1945. The Americans are here to run Japan. There's a young Japanese officer cleaning out his desk. And on the wall is this giant map of East Asia. And he sees the American come in, and this Japanese officer walks over, pounds his fist against the map, says, Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, now it's your turn. And incidentally, so that kind of that idea of reintegrating Japan with its old co-prosperity sphere is going to be a big part of American policies. And Vietnam is one aspect of that. And the fear is, and the Japanese are very shrewd, they play this up, they say, you know, if you guys don't help us out by, you know, reintegrating us with these markets, we're going to have to make an accommodation with the Chinese. And after 1949, that's not something the Americans want to see happen. So you can really kind of see that, you know, you've got this situation where the U.S. has to come in fighting two wars to secure the Pacific Rim in Korea and in Vietnam for the sake of creating this kind of integrated world system. Now, incidentally, that's being challenged right now. By which country? That idea of this kind of American-led imperium in East Asia. What country is kind of coming up and beginning to challenge the U.S. there? Yeah, not so much Russia. Who's a lot bigger and better than the Russians? China, right? The Chinese are issuing these fictitious maps where they show their airspace going further and further and further down into the South China Sea, and are beginning to really, really terrify these people down here in Southeast Asia and in the Philippines and Indonesia. You know, so the idea is, you know, kind of this American-led imperium is now beginning to be challenged by the Chinese, but it's, you know, it's had a 70-year run. It's a long time to run the show, you know, on somebody else's continent. Okay, so you've got then this idea, this domino theory, and the U.S. is going to say, okay, yay, we've got our side, our half of Vietnam, it's run by our people, we brought our man Diem in, and there he is, and notice there's Eisenhower, and that's John Foster Dulles, his Secretary of State, and that's Diem. And Diem's a good Roman Catholic, he's an ardent nationalist. I used to be very, very down on Diem, and now I'm not so down on Diem. I think Diem was, you know, probably about as good as we were going to get, but he did have weaknesses, and one of them was this word. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this word. Nepotism. You guys know what nepotism means? Do you do, Tyler?
It's kind of like Andrew Jackson, the spoil system, where you can kind of bring in your friends.
Okay. Only in this case, it's your family members. Okay, so nepotism would be, and he's got a sister-in-law and brother-in-law in the news who are really kind of take advantage of the situation. He's Roman Catholic, French-speaking, English-speaking, but he's in a predominantly Buddhist part of the country. And lastly, not all the communists left. By 1957, there's a full-out insurrection going on in South Vietnam. The National Liberation Front, not the NFL, but the NLF. But what do we call the Southern Vietnamese communists? Any guesses? His nickname's Charlie. Victor Charlie. VC. Oh yeah, you guys are good. So the Viet Cong. And during the 60s and 70s, there was all this long-winded discussion about, you know, the Viet Cong. Yeah, they're this autonomous liberation movement. They have nothing to do with the North. They have nothing to do with international communism. Wrong. They're completely a creature of the North. We know it now through the, you know, the documentation has come out since the end of the Vietnam War and the end of the Cold War. And in fact, their creation was very much orchestrated by the North, as was their activities. Now, this is going to bear bitter fruit for the VC and with the Tet Offensive that we'll talk about later. I was at a Schaefer conference, which is a Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations, and this is, I don't know, a while ago, 10, 15 years ago. But there was a guy there talking about, you know, what he discovered in Vietnamese archives, and one of them was that the VC, after Tet, were basically blown away. They just couldn't, hardly even an operational force. That's one thing. Secondly, they're extremely bitter with North Vietnam because they felt that they'd been manipulated and were just kind of sacrificial lambs that were just thrown out there as part of the larger strategy to get the U.S. to quit. And there's still acrimony in Vietnam between Southern Vietnamese communists and North Vietnamese communists. Be that as it may, this is a formidable foe. If you've ever seen The Big Lebowski, The one character, the John Goodman character, is constantly going on about, you know, man in black pajamas. Now that's a foe to be reckoned with. For those of you who've seen the beginning of Apocalypse Now, it's like, we're in here getting soft and Charlie's out in the bush getting stronger. I always think that when I deal with my creepy Charlie in the backyard. Wow, new president! America's first good-looking president, John F. Kennedy. And look, he's got a map of Vietnam behind him. Now, we've already seen Eisenhower. It started with Truman. Now it's Eisenhower. It was Eisenhower. Now it's Kennedy. Now, you guys remember what Kennedy's strategic doctrine was? You guys wrote about it in that DBQ?
Or no, sorry, that was
Flexible response. Eisenhower New Look, which is basically premised on massive retaliation and covert ops, and that really didn't work well in Vietnam. So it kind of went, well, we'll create this Republic of South Vietnam, and then Kennedy comes in and he's got this more nuanced approach where they're going to be dealing with what they call counterinsurgency. And there's this, I was looking at the Schaefer conference for this year, and they have one of the panels is about counterinsurgency, and they keep talking about this magic example of the British in Malaysia, who were able to use counterinsurgency and strategic hamlets and stuff to go after communist rebels. And remember that Kennedy saying we're going to use counterinsurgency, Green Berets, then use people like the Peace Corps, Nation Build, and we're going to flexibly going to be able to react to communism in the third world, but also really, you know, be able to work with people who did have honest, nationalistic, and liberation-driven motivations. Well, Kennedy's going to come in and he's going to start an escalation. So there's about 1,000 American advisors when Kennedy comes into office. There's 14,000 by the time of his death. And so they're going to be giving Hueys and you know, these helicopters, going to be training, there's going to be advisors training the South Vietnamese. Now you'll notice it's going to have another acronym here. A lot of acronyms are flying today. We love them. We've got VC, Victor Charlie. Now we've got ARVN. Marvin Arvin. Army of the Republic of Vietnam. These are your South Vietnamese soldiers. So ARVN is going to go out and contest the countryside against the VC. So this is, you're really talking 1961, 1962. Into 1963, there's a really great book, it's a big book called A Bright Shining Light about this kind of counterinsurgency. And they really talk about it. The turning point being this battle of Outback, AP, back, BAC, where the VC actually stand and fight the helicopters and start downing them. And it's a real mess. And part of that, what contributes to that, is this, which are these strategic hamlets. And the Strategic Hamlet Project, if you ever want to see a great movie, John Wayne, the old Western hero actor, out of his own money, did a movie about Vietnam called The Green Berets. And it was kind of set in the strategic hamlet. So you understand. So here you've got this kind of, you know, walled perimeter there. And then you have these, you know, you have these kind of installations, barracks and stuff, and bathrooms and schools. And so you take the friendly people and you put them in this fort. And you give them armaments, training, healthcare, democracy, consumer products, weapons. And you help them defend themselves in the countryside, and then be able to, you know, pinpoint anybody who's left outside as being VC. Now, can anybody think of a problem with this approach?
It leaves them out in the open.
What do you mean?
Well, they're just on the VC can attack them at any time. They're just there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what else?
So they're essentially making civilian soldiers?
Yeah, kind of. Or, you know, at least getting the civilians away from the bad guys, and hopefully training guys to be, you know, ARVN or something in your army. But I'm just thinking, so you've got the camp, and it's full of your good people. right?
Is it food there?
Yeah, okay, you gotta feed them. You're taking them out of their fields.
How long would you help them?
That's a good question. Well, here's a question for you. In that movie, the John Wayne movie, the John Wayne character, see that? I can't remember whether it's John Wayne character or Taylor Sonnet. It's an amazing movie. They cast this guy out there and he's pacing off distances between like the barracks and stuff. Yeah.
What if there's bad guys inside?
Oh, you were good. And can you tell who's the good or bad guys? Do you have that little, that litmus tape paper? Oh, there's a communist. Yeah, Jonas is going to be interested. Little daughter's a commie, right? You can't come up. I hate to tell you this, sir. Okay. But you've got these, you can have communists in there. And I like what you also said about how this vulnerable this is. You know, these guys could attack, they could have, people inside there to help them out. And in fact, that's what happens. In a lot of cases, these things get overrun. And of course, they're full of weapons. And those weapons fall into the hands of the VC. Between 61 and 63, there's suddenly this huge uptick in the fighting capability of the VC because they get all this firepower from these strategic hamlets. Now, one other thing that comes in is the enormous corruption of the DM regime. Mention nepotism. Well, the new family, not NEW, but NHU, they pocket a lot of the resources that are supposed to go into these. So these people aren't even armed that well. They're not being taken care of. They're crowded. They're taken out of their villages. So it's not a very good policy, and it accelerates the loss of the countryside in many areas. And by the way, there's a really good movie about this kind of early American experience in Vietnam. It's called The Quiet American. It's based on a Graham Greene book, and the guy in it is Brandon Fraser. He's kind of like one of these movie stars. He used to be really big in the 90s, but he's a pretty interesting actor. He's done some, but it came out in 2001, and it was so deemed to be so anti-American that they pulled it because of 9/11. They wouldn't circulate it. But it's a good movie, I think, and it kind of shows you the mayhem that this guy reaps, this good, quiet American who shows up and is trying to do good, and it just goes nuts. And of course, one other aspect of this, as I mentioned, this is a predominantly Buddhist area. This is a self-immolation of a Buddhist monk, and yes, and the DM government is really not handling the situation very well. In fact, they're beginning to go after, they're suspecting that the Buddhists are in league with the communists, so they're sending their men into the pagodas. This is an overwhelmingly Buddhist country, and they're attacking the principal religion. Of course, remember, DM and his buddies are Roman Catholics. And so in protest, you get these self-immolations of monks. Now, Madame New, the sister-in-law, looks at this and says, she called it a Buddhist barbecue, which didn't go over well. So by mid to late 1963, I'm jumping ahead a bit, Kennedy is beginning to realize that DM is losing control. And remember, you set yourself up here, folks. You've got a nation state. You've said you're going to defend it. It's your country. Your prestige is on the line. And then think about that Truman Doctrine speech, that logic of containment. If you don't defend freedom everywhere, you're going to undermine it everywhere. So Kennedy gives the okay for a CIA coup that is going to, he allows the CIA to allow a military coup to take place. The generals come to him and say, we've got to get rid of DM. They say, fine. He assumed that DM would be allowed to escape. Unfortunately, DM was taken out back and murdered in a half-track. So this is a guy we had brought in, put into power, kept him there for 7 years, and now he's dead. And 3 weeks later, John F. Kennedy's going to be dead. And into this comes yet another president. Look at this, Lyndon Johnson. So Johnson comes in November of 1963, and he's president until January of 1969. Now, let's think about where Johnson's coming from. Johnson's the liberals' liberal, right? What's he trying to get through Congress during 1964 and 1965, at the same time as Vietnam is becoming very, very destabilized?
Civil rights.
Okay, civil rights, what else? What do we call that entire group of legislation? It's not just civil rights, right? It's things like Medicare, war on poverty. It's not a nice society, it's a... Oh, you are good. Yeah. So Johnson comes in and has to push through, he's pushing through his Great Society programs. And underneath Great Society, they usually put civil rights, war on poverty, things like Medicare, an expansion of the welfare state, maximum feasible participation. Okay? And Johnson, and here's Johnson's problem. He has to get this stuff through Congress. What happens if he allows Vietnam to fall? Between November of '63 and mid-1965, I'm pretty sure there's at least 7 different governments that come and go in and out in South Vietnam. What happens if Vietnam falls? Politically, domestically, what do you think?
There'd probably be some kind of uproar, because by this point the American public is really scared of the whole domino theory, and they'll believe that Vietnam falls, and it's kind of the beginning of it.
Okay. And, he really give his domestic critics an awful lot. Of course, he's running in 1964 against Barry Goldwater. Says what we really need to do is throw a couple of nukes into the men's room at the Kremlin. And Johnson is able to portray Goldwater as a nut, right? Goldwater's election motto was, in your heart you know he's right, and Johnson turned that, in your guts you know he's nuts. But Johnson himself, though, realizes, as he says himself, he doesn't want to see this bitch of a war kill the only woman he ever loved, which is his Great Society programs. He realizes that he has to be tough on communism, and incidentally, he's a cold warrior. There's nothing in his background that suggests that he wouldn't try to contain communism. There's nothing in John F. Kennedy's behavior or background that would suggest he wasn't going to do everything that was necessary to contain communism. Kennedy escalated, Johnson's going to escalate further. And there's a lot of, there's kind of the Kennedy mythos and mythology is that John F. Kennedy was ready to get us out of Vietnam. I don't know of anybody who's found any indication that that's the truth. And understand as well that Johnson's going to inherit this whole crew of Kennedy advisors, including Bob McNamara, who's your Secretary of Defense. And these guys are saying, look, if we just put enough pressure on the North Vietnamese, they'll put enough pressure on the South Vietnamese communists, and we can maybe get these guys to back off. They use like this thing of almost rolling up a toothpaste tube until finally the end blows off. Right? So there's this kind of perceived rationality. So Johnson is going to come in 1964, and there's really, Taylor Branch has written some really great books on kind of the Martin Luther King years. And he talks about this amazing balancing act that Johnson's doing between, right at the time he's trying to push through the Civil Rights Act, and trying to hold together Republicans and Democrats to push that through. He has to do something about what happens in Vietnam, which supposedly happened, maybe did, maybe didn't, and in the Gulf of Tonkin. And the Gulf of Tonkin is off the coast of North Vietnam, and allegedly a couple of American cruisers were attacked, the Maddox and the Turner Joy. And this happened in August of 1964. And, Johnson himself says, hell, I think those boys are just shooting at a bunch of flying fish out there. But what comes out of this is that, so you get flying fish in there? But what comes out of this is Johnson goes to Congress and says, I need authorization to do what I need to do in Vietnam, and Congress gives it to him. So I know, if I gave Carolyn a check, that if I just signed one of my checks and just gave it to her, that she would only fill in $1.99 on there. She's such an honest person, right? Do you think I should trust her? He says no. Anyway, Well, that's, Congress basically does have Lyndon Johnson thinking, well, you know, Lyndon, you can take care of it. And some people would say this is kind of like the high point of what historians have called the imperial presidency. The presidency in the Cold War really aggregated a lot of power at the expense of Congress. And the Congress at this point literally is giving Johnson the power to do anything he sees fit to take care of Vietnam and take care of American personnel over there. If you read the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, it's not very long, and it's passed with near unanimity. I think Wayne Morris and Ernst Rooney, Alaska and Oregon senators, the only people who voted against this thing. And Johnson's then going to use this to escalate the American war against the VC, and that includes bombing up to the North Vietnamese border, just kind of rolling thunder. And I just want to ask you guys a question. If you are going to set up air bases so you can start bombing, and if you were a local VC, right, we know already that you're a local VC, right? You're Victor Charlie. And maybe you've you know, convinced Carolyn to join you in your communist ways, right? And you know that there's an air base up in Cedarburg, and they're bombing the living hell out of, you know, your strongholds. What are you going to do about that air base? You know, they're launching jets. Okay, you say, boom, blow them up, right? And all it takes a couple of good mortar rounds, you know, and of course you got people working on the base and they're telling you what's going on and inside. Okay, yeah, here's approximately how far it is. So there you can sight it in and blow it up. And that's exactly what happens in an air base called Pleiku. So if you're the Americans, so preach the American here, I suppose you commies. And if you're the American and Victor Charlie over here is attacking your air base, what are you going to need? What are you going to need to protect your air base and your jets?
Weapons and ground forces.
Okay. You guys get that? They call it, I think they call it boots on the ground. You need to have somebody defending your air bases. And of course, to keep Victor Charlie away from the air bases and you're not exactly sure where he's at, you start doing these search and destroy missions, going out into the countryside, circling around, and this very rapidly leads to an enormous escalation. Now, of course, we've got a new player in the ground as well. We're back to our old map. Is Victor Charlie or the VC, the only communist in South Vietnam by 1966, 1967? What if you marched down here from the north through the Ho Chi Minh Trail and came down into South Vietnam? So literally, you get on after 1965, more and more what they call NVA regulars, North Vietnamese Army regulars. These are North Vietnamese Army, they're not VC, they're marching down. And what I always like about this is they basically tell these guys, come back when we've won. You know, or die. But you're not going to come back until this thing's over. Now you compare that to the Americans. How did the Americans get all their army and their military forces for Vietnam in the 1960s? Yeah, they're conscripting guys. How popular is that? Right? All those protesters, you know, Mr. Silver and all the rest of these guys who are jumping out of the Sterling Hall, not just Sterling Hall, but out of the Commerce Building windows in 1966, 1967. Huge protest. And these guys are coming over for a year. And then getting the hell out if they can. Hopefully. You know, who's going to fight harder? Who's going to be in there for long? I always like the stories about what they give these guys, these North Vietnamese Army. They give them these, essentially these sandals made out of old tires. You can walk on them, old tread of old tires, and you walk down. That's it. So they're coming down, and they're coming into the South, and you're getting more and more and more of them. Of course, that means that the U.S. keeps putting more and more in there. And you know, the bottom line, I mean, I'm not exactly sure the exact numbers, but it's approximately 500,000 Americans in Vietnam by the beginning of 1968. And they're doing these search and destroy missions. And here's where we come back to, remember we talked a bit about the best and the brightest. We talked about, McNamara. Remember McNamara could, when he argued with you, it's not just point A, point B. He'd have point double A, point double B. It's like the most annoying friend you've ever had. You ever argue with like friends and they just get you and they just keep piling on. I mean, this guy's got not just 1, 2, or 3 reasons why you're wrong. He's got 45 reasons why you're wrong. And McNamara and the rest of his guys, Walt Rostow, all these intellectuals, these action intellectuals that Kennedy brought in, and now Johnson's inherited. These guys are going to have these guys go out, and they're going to keep track of who they're killing. And they're going to have these kill rates, and they're going to be putting down these numbers. And I remember when I was a kid, I was really little. The nightly news, on NBC, they would have. It's almost like a scoreboard. You'd have the American deaths and wounded, the South Vietnamese deaths and wounded, then the NBA and BC deaths and wounded. And always a lot more NBA were biting the dust than we were. And so these guys are doing these kill tallies and coming up with these numbers that then are feeding into these computers. I mean, at one point, McNamara's like, every quantitative measure we have shows we're winning this war. And the whole time they're going out, they're just this is what they call Zippo tours. They go around as Zippo as a lighter and they'd be burning villages and stuff. And of course McNamara is just coming down and saying, well, we got Charlie on the run. This thing's successful. We're dropping X number of tons, we're killing X number of these guys. There's a lot of hearsay with Vietnam. And I'm not sure the accuracy of this, but it's a great thing to think about. At one point during the Vietnam War, and I heard this in a college lecture, so you can take it with a grain of salt. There was some indications that the numbers that the Pentagon had was that we killed everybody in North Vietnam. Because these guys are just going around indiscriminately just killing folks, or killing who they think are BC, and you guys already acknowledged that would be very difficult to differentiate. And so they're just getting these numbers. So by 1968, late 67, early 68, the Americans, Johnson administration is feeling pretty confident about how things are going. We've had this massive escalation. We've got Charlie on the run. And they bring William Westmoreland back to the United States. He's the general in charge in Vietnam. And he comes out, he goes on all Meet the Press, all the television shows and stuff, does these press conferences, and there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We got Charlie on the run. We're going to win this thing. And understand, Johnson's just like, don't come home till you can nail a coonskin to the wall. I don't know what the hell that's supposed to mean, but, some kind of earthyism that he comes up with. Well, I want to show you something that happens in early 1968, and I want you to pay close attention to the rationale that comes out of this. So, let's see, I want to go up to here, okay? And this is from a documentary. It's a very anti-war documentary, but it has some very good footage. I want you to pay attention to this television footage. This is what was on the nightly news, and contrast it to the carefully controlled media access we have from Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. So this is the stuff that will be on there. And what happened is, in 1968, the VC, the Viet Cong, Southern Communists, carried out a giant uprising against South Vietnam called the Tet Offensive. And the idea was to bring the Republic of South Vietnam down and force the United States to deal directly with the VC and the NVA to end the war and get out. Now they're going to succeed, but not for the reasons they want. Now I want you to watch this. The other thing is Bob McNamara quits and a guy named Clark Clifford comes in, and we'll see some footage of Clifford. And I want you to pay attention to his rationale and the kinds of things he learns about this war. So, let's see if this will work. Okay, maybe not. So they grabbed the American embassy. those are Americans, those are BC who had grabbed the American embassy, and it took them hours to get these guys out.
Saigon for 7 hours will be a story to rally and inspire the Viet Cong.
Now listen.
From ABC News at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon.
Now this is Westmoreland. That's Westmoreland. Listen to what he says.
In World War II, that after the enemy spoke himself, we would defeat him. He would be weakened. And we could follow that up through the use of the maximum military force that we could bring to bear on him through the bombing, through the mining of the harbors, through the cutting of his lines of communication. By moving in and cleaning out his sanctuaries, the enemy would have no choice but to come to some accommodation.
In the beginning of 1968, General Westmoreland needed 206,000 more troops. We met hour after hour after hour in the Pentagon, and I started in and asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff, how long do you think it will still be in the war? None of them knew. Do you think that the 206,000 men will be enough? Nobody knew. Well, might we have to send more men? Well, possibly. Well, in 6 months, we don't know. A year, 18 months? I couldn't get answers to these questions. By the end of that 4-day interrogation, I was getting down by the end of it into very serious questions like, do any of you men, as you look at it objectively, do you find any diminution in the will of the enemy to fight? Well, they said, no, we guess we don't. Are they sending the same number of men down to the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Well, yes, and even they might be a little more. And how about our bombing? We've placed great reliance on our bombing. Is our bombing stopping them? No. Well, what is the amount of attrition that our bombings cause? Well, maybe 10 to 15%. Do I remember asking one question? Well, if a North Vietnamese field commander in South Vietnam needed 1,000 men, they said yes. If he asked for, say, 1,200 men, 1,000 would get through. Well, that's right. Well, then he'd have the 1,000 that he really needed. Well, yeah, that's all. Well, this type of interrogation, finally by the end of 4 or 5 days, I must say that my thinking had undergone a very substantial revolution.
Okay, so you guys see that? So Clifford is brought in, and Westmoreland says we've got the guys on the ropes, right? And the Americans are like, what are you talking about? We saw this. They grabbed our embassy. They're shooting. They're blowing the hell out of the country. Out of our men, out of Saigon, and how can you say that this war is almost over? Well, one of the things, there's a oldie but goodie book out there called Big Story by a guy named Peter Braceroot. And one of the things he found was that the media in the Tet Offensive is that because it was a surprise attack, the American media was stuck in the cities. And you understand, this isn't like today where your cell phone, where your smartphone is the best video camera in the world. I mean, those television cameras are huge, and you had to be able to tote them out and set those things up. So what the media was able to show was a very, very narrow kind of sliver of what was going on. What happened in the countryside? Remember we talked about our litmus test paper? If I could go up there and go, oh, there's a commie. Well, guess what? Because of Tet, you knew who the commies were. The VC came up. It was an uprising. And Arvin fought. The Republic of South Vietnam did not fall. And the Viet Cong were crippled from that point forward. They were done. But that's not what the perception was back in the United States. So, interestingly enough, what you got then was this split between the United States and the Republic of South Vietnam, because from that point forward, the U.S. wanted out. And yeah, there was a lot of people in the U.S. that said we should go in there more, and everybody's always brave in retrospect. Like, we should have invaded the North. My understanding is that the Chinese made it very apparent that if the U.S. had invaded North Vietnam, they would have involved themselves militarily. Had the Chinese ever done that? Really? With the United States in any other war? Yes. They had come in Korea, didn't they? So one of the military history lessons is don't fight the previous war. We had the previous peninsula, the Chinese came in, we weren't expecting it, all these other kinds of things. But on the other hand, it would have been a really awful war, and after a point you said, what are you really trying to do? But the big issue is that after Tet, the U.S. is really trying to get itself out, and there's a question of who's going to do it. You've got these anti-war movements. It's the little hippie flower children putting their flowers in the end of the loaded rifles for the National Guard. Nobody wants to go fight in this thing. You've got 500,000 American troops there. Henry Kissinger quipped that the only reason Vietnam matters is because 500,000 American soldiers were there. It's dividing the nation. It's destroyed your consensus around containment. And you're at risk of losing an entire generation of Americans who should be going in and running global capitalism, quite frankly. So there's a big question about just what do you do in 1968. And one of the things that happens is that Tet and the resulting the kind of political fallout deprived me of one of the world's great historical events. And I'm still mad and bitter about this. Namely, a Lyndon Johnson-Richard Nixon presidential election, which would have been the slugfest of all time. Would have been the nastiest campaign ever. Because what happened was that Lyndon Johnson ran into opposition, and even though he won the New Hampshire primary, there was enough opposition to suggest that he was losing support of many Democratic voters. He opted not to run for re-election in 1968. So this is a guy who won his huge landslide in 1964, but 1968, because of the Vietnam War, he's deciding not to run. Now the question is, who's going to take his place? The one front runner who emerged was Bobby Kennedy. This gives you an idea of the kind of charisma and the kind of, just this guy was had with younger voters and was really trying to make that link between the kind of anti-war and other progressive parts that are progressive forces in the United States. And unfortunately, in June, after winning the California primary, he was actually gunned down and murdered as well. And so that left the field to...
Is that when he was shot?
Well, this is where he was shot, and then this is the Democratic National Convention. I was going to say this is the Bucks game the other night, but that was pretty bad. Chicago guys came up here and roughed things up. But this is the Democratic National Convention in 1968, where anti-war prisoners were attacked by Chicago cops, and the Democrats nominated Hubert Humphrey, who damn near won. I mean, he came very close to winning. And into this came Richard Nixon, and we mentioned this. Nixon had this secret plan on how to win, him and Kissinger, and they were able to, to hold sway in this election by a very, very, very small margin. So what did Nixon want to do? And his view was that the United States needed to get out of Vietnam. But they had, as he always said, peace with honor. And you had to have a non-communist Republic of South Vietnam that wasn't going to have 500,000 American troops there. So what Nixon did, this brings us to that next phase. Nixon, now notice we've got another president here, right? This is our fourth one. Is this lasting a while? Other than the fact you've been here for almost 65 minutes. Sorry, guys. And what this brings us to, though, is this is Nixon is going to really say we've got to have this different way of dealing with foreign policy. And one part of it is going to be Vietnamization. And Vietnamization, what do you suppose that means?
Like using some Vietnamese as soldiers rather than Americans. Reducing the amount of...
Yeah, so there you go. Perfect. You would start, again, my dissertation advisor would say, you would replace the color of the corpses, or the corpses from being Vietnamese to being from being American to being Vietnamese. And how is this supposed to work globally? So one of the things that you got is Nixon is looking at how the U.S. can disengage itself from Vietnam. I really wish I had a better marker. Okay, maybe I can grab one real fast. This thing's dead.
Oh, yeah, so, hey. I'm so much.
Let's see if this works any better. Okay, so if you have the U.S. over here, and you have Vietnam, and one of the things that Nixon notices is, you know, he wants to get the United States out. Who would you go to? Who do you think could actually influence the North Vietnamese to leave South Vietnam alone long enough so you can get your troops out of there?
China, yeah.
Okay, China, right? So one thing is you could go deal with the PRC. And the idea would be they would be able to put pressure on the North Vietnamese and hopefully allow them for this, you know, this Vietnamization and this withdrawal to provide that decent interval between when the United States leaves and the Republic of South Vietnam falls. So that's going to be one aspect of that. And so Nixon did. In February 1972, he went to China and he's going to meet with Mao. Who else could you then go to try to put other pressure on the Vietnamese? Who are your other communists out there?
Soviets.
Yeah, the USSR. Now, here's the issue. Do the Soviets and the Chinese get along? Now, remember, we talked about this. The Sino-Soviet split is going to be one of the kind of realities of global politics starting in around 1960. Remember Madame Khrushchev, and Khrushchev visited and the Chinese hosts fed them tiger-eating dragon, which was snake and cat. And so the Soviets are going to see this, you know, the People's Republic of China getting a strategic leg up on them. So they're much more amenable to kind of come along and try to make a deal with the United States as well. And the United States would say, what we want to do is get some kind of linkage between our approaches to these communist powers and their behavior with reference to their client state, namely North Vietnam. Now, with the People's Republic of China, this comes to this with, you know, the beginning of thought, this thought in relationships. It's interesting to read Nixon and Kissinger's views on, wow, we're meeting Mao and Joe and Lonnie. These dudes are real heavy hitters. It's kind of like, you know, Aerosmith meeting the Stones, right? Wow, we're going to meet the Rolling Stones finally, and they just came falling all over themselves. So you've got then this movement towards the People's Republic of China. The Soviet Union, what would you be trying to do with the Soviet Union? What's your relationships like this with the Soviet Union in the 60s? Okay. And what's really causing a lot of tension and fear?
Like the threat of nuclear.
Okay. You guys got that? You have this unbelievably nasty nuclear arms race. And it's expensive, and it's becoming even more expensive, and you literally have tens of thousands of these weapons, of these warheads, and thousands of launchers facing each other. So Nixon and Kissinger say, look, we're going to appeal to the Soviet Union and appeal to them like in their national interests. And this is a big difference between Nixon and Reagan. Nixon saw the Soviet Union as just being like another power and really dealing with them in a very pragmatic way. Ronald Reagan saw the Soviet Union as evil. It's a moral problem for Ronald Reagan. So we'll get to Reagan, you can see how that plays out. But Nixon goes in there and he says, you know what? What we need to do is we need to have a strategic arms limitation treaty, SALT I, where we'll put, you know, a limitation on the number of launchers you have. And we'll have, you know, eventually a SALT II, which actually put a limitation on the number of warheads. Notice you're not reducing anything, but at least you're putting a cap on this. And in exchange, you're going to have all sorts of things like technology transfers, grain shipments to the Soviet Union, but you're also going to have a code of conduct. And this code of conduct is going to modify, the Soviets are going to agree to modifying their conduct and behavior in the third world. So I think that's something to keep in mind. You're going to have this code of conduct, and the Soviets are going to say, well, sure, we'll sign this. And they'll just solve one agreement. Well, the problem was there's a fundamental misinterpretation of what SALT I meant. From the American standpoint, this was the Soviets are promising to behave themselves. From the Soviet standpoint, it's a recognition of their co-equal status as a superpower, and now they can behave like the Americans have in the third world. And that misunderstanding is going to poison the relationships as you go forward in the 1970s. In 1971, 1972, what Nixon is saying, hey, this is going to give us the in with these guys, and they're going to modify their behavior in places like Vietnam. And that's going to give us, in combination with our policies of Vietnamization, our ability to get out. And so, you have this grand design by Nixon, and he starts to carry this out. And so I'll turn this thing back over and just see if we can keep going with this. But one of the things he does then, I'll back this up a little bit, let's see, is he starts with Vietnamization, which means he's going to increase the bombing. I mean, this is Vietnam, so there's so much going on in this. But one thing is going to increase the bombing, and they're going to be bombing the living hell out of North Vietnam as well as South Vietnam, incursions into Cambodia and Laos. So that's going to be one aspect of this. Another aspect of this is going to be an increase in American advisors, but also an increase in American incursions into other. It gets really, really ugly. You talk about, your famous joke that the GIs are telling, how do you win in Vietnam? And the answer is you take all the friendlies, the people who support the United States, you put them on boats in the South China Sea. Then you blow up Vietnam, kill everything, pave it, and then you sink the boats. In other words, the relationship between the American soldiers and ARVN and the people on the ground levels gets really, really ugly. These are photos taken at My Lai, where an American patrol went kind of haywire and killed nearly 1,000 people. And these are men, women, and children. These are old people, kids. And it came out, and it was really ugly. So you get this real kind of this Vietnam is just not going well. But the United States is getting out. By 1973, the United States all our soldiers are basically out of there. But Vietnam's going to have one more victim, or at least one more casualty, and that's going to be Richard Nixon himself. Nixon spends an awful lot of time domestically attacking and trying to undermine critics of his administration. He has an enemies list, including Paul Newman, in Newman's Own Dressing, that awful Paul Newman, right? And he's really fixated on the fact that he can't keep a secret. In other words, all this stuff keeps leaking. Now, who do you hire to bring in when you have leaks? No, come on. At your house, who would you hire? A leak? A plumber, right? So we had the plumbers in a special investigative unit out of his basement of the White House, and these guys were going out and they were doing things like breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at Watergate. And there's very little evidence to suggest that Nixon knew about the break-in, but he damn well knew about the cover-up. Because we know that on June 20th, 1972, he ordered H.R. Haldeman to get a hold of the FBI, get a hold of the CIA and tell the FBI to knock it off and get out of there and stop investigating, which, by the way, is not something you should be doing. Obstruction of justice, it's called, which is a felony. And how do we know it?
The tape.
Oh, yes. So when you become president, make sure you don't tape anything. Because once they found out about the tapes, then the whole thing was about who's going to get access to the tapes. Now, Nixon could have taken the tapes out, and he could have made a big bonfire on the White House lawn and just burned them. But it would have made him look pretty bad. So he tried to say, no, these are wrong. And the Supreme Court found and said, no, as a matter of fact, we can't have these. And so they took them. And it showed that Richard Nixon indeed had done all the, this wasn't a very appealing portrait of the guy. So Nixon is, rather than be impeached and be convicted, he resigned in August of 1974. And so I think the Democrats made the biggest mistake ever going after Nixon like that, because then they're going to get Reagan out of it. They didn't know that at the time. So we're almost there. Things are looking, Vietnam's bad enough, right? But it keeps going. Notice we've got another president here, Jerry Ford, which I think is about our 5th or 6th president going along here. And Ford is going to come in and he's going to preside over this decent interval, which is going to collapse in April of 1975 with a North Vietnamese offensive across the 17th parallel into and up to Saigon. The South Vietnamese regime collapses. The U.S. Congress refused to vote for any kind of money to help, for an intervention to help them. Here's a picture of a helicopter being loaded that's going to actually take people to the American embassy. They're going to be transported out. But this is how it all ends in April of 1975 with the end in Vietnam. Why does this matter? Well, I would suggest that at this point, your consensus, your liberal consensus around nation building and containment is pretty shattered. And you're going to have what is called this Vietnam syndrome, where the United States is going to be very, very circumspect in the application of force globally. Even Ronald Reagan is going to be pretty circumspect about it. But it's also going to set things up for this fundamental misunderstanding between the Soviet Union and the United States in the late 1970s that's going to cause animosities to reemerge. It's going to allow for kind of a reemergence of containment around Ronald Reagan, who's ultimately going to be able to end this thing. Okay? So you guys beginning to see how things are unraveling bit by bit. Okay? So I'm going to stop this thing, and then I've got to figure out how to put this thing up online, and you guys will have it for your viewing pleasure.